Wow, you're right. It doesn't bug around.
It's not, it's obnoxious, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. It's Jason Furno here representing the Mining Mavericks. The Mining Mavericks are a curated group of industry leaders who are passionate about making the industry better and more sustainable for everyone. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by James Scott of Fireweed Zinc, who currently holds the role of SVP projects. James, welcome. Excited to have you here today, man. How you doing?
Hi, Jason. Good to be here.
Excellent. So, James, you began your career in geology with various companies such as Copper Fox Metals, Mega Silver, Capstone Mining, Richfield Ventures, and then you shifted into a more project management type capacity over at Kamenek Gold, and then Gold Corp, where you and I first crossed paths. And now, as we mentioned, you're at Fireweed Zinc. So, can you talk about the shift, maybe from geology to more of a PM type capacity?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's actually a pretty good story because as it happened, it was exactly 10 years ago today that I woke up in a wall tent on a project in the middle of BC after having worked in the field for over, yeah, actually coming up on almost a decade at that point. And it was a project where, things were going really well. It was a really interesting project, but I'd just gone through a number of failed relationships because all I did was work in the field. And I woke up in this wall tent. I'm like, I got to figure out how to transition my career to something that isn't quite so field based and that plays to more of my strengths in bringing people together, bringing teams together, and achieving things that might not necessarily just involve supervision of drills. So from that, it was looking for opportunities in industry to change my career trajectory, and that led me to look into and learn more about QA/QC,
Hmm.
43101 reporting, writing internal reports, and that actually opened the door to a few other positions. And Kamenak then came along. I was, because of this QA/QC interest of mine, was asked to participate in on the owner's side in the development of 43101 reports. And for any
Mhm.
listeners who don't know 43101 reports, they're technical reports that are required for providing updates on projects under a Canadian national instrument. So um, I
Yeah.
did a lot of that, and then it came time to do the PEA, and it was a natural fit to help coordinate that on the owner's side. I was helping out industry veteran who came on to lead that, a guy who'd been working in industry for 40 years, who was tapped by the management of Kamenak to lead that project. Worked very closely with him, and then he wanted to step away from the project. And it was a situation where people took a chance on me. They saw some
Hmm.
potential and they said, yeah, I think he can do it. He's never done it before. But why don't you lead the feasibility study on the owner's side and then partner with the contractor, which at the time was JDS, to lead the feasibility study for the coffee project. And that project went incredibly well. I learned a ton through that process. And through that entire transition, the only reason any of it was possible is because people took a chance on me. And I had people who I could learn from and who were very open with teaching and willing to acknowledge my weaknesses and my gaps in knowledge areas and experience and help me fill those. And so, one of the things that maybe we can talk about later on is the role of mentoring and the importance of finding champions in organizations to help your career advancement. And I think it's a combination of those things that made it possible for me to transition into project management.
Sure. Yeah, no, appreciate that. That's really good context and good story. For those who don't know, James and I worked together for a year and a half, 2 years on the coffee project, something in that range. And one of the things that you hit on was collaboration and team building and teamwork and stuff like that, which I think you and I both put a lot of effort, energy, and emphasis into, which ultimately helped us be successful. Now, the coffee project has gone in different direction based on company priorities and the like. But nonetheless, I think from a team standpoint, we were pretty successful in building collaborative relationships. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think when we were working together, that project was, I think, going very well. There were obviously, there's always challenges. Every project has challenges. But the level of collaboration that occurred on that project, and for people who aren't familiar with the project, there was the Goldcorp, the owners. Prior to that, it was Kamenak. There was a transition there, which was, transitions of ownership are always challenging.
For sure.
Then we had a primary contractor, JDS, but then working in that team, I think we had about 12 different subcontractors, and maybe even more, covering all the different disciplines. So to bring them all together into a place where everyone could collaborate and work effectively to make the project better than the sum of its parts required, I think the most important thing that we sort of facilitated was developing good trust between all the groups. And part of developing that trust, I think, was clearly defining the boundaries of different roles so that people weren't concerned about stepping on each other's toes or having interference where they were having to sort of protect their territory, because each role was very clearly delineated so that the overlap was minimized. And because there wasn't competition for those overlap areas, people trusted each other that they would stay in their swim lanes, or whatever you want to call it. And then the group could come together, solve problems together, throw ideas around in a way that is safe for them, so that gets into like psychological safety, that they're not going to have the rug pulled out from under them.
Sure, yeah.
And other things like that. And I think one of the things that actually you and I did that's very similar is our approach to collaboration is what I kind of call facilitated collaboration, where we ask the questions, because
Sure.
we're both sort of generalists. And I think the role of a generalist is important because we don't know all the answers, but our teams do. And by asking the right questions, we can push them in directions that might not be conventional standard answers, and might come up with creative solutions to things by asking a series of questions from a generalist's point of view that takes into a multidisciplinary approach that has these expert teams that have a more narrow specialization, enables them to reach outside of what they would normally see as the standard answers and maybe look a little bit more broadly to solutions that otherwise wouldn't come up.
Yeah, no, you said there's a lot of things that I want to unpack there, James. I think there's a lot of really good stuff there. Collaboration being a key, trust being another, and then, really questioning, not with the intent of figuring out whether somebody's right or wrong, but really questioning with the intent to understand and
Yes.
to make sure that we've optimized the direction that we're going, what is possible. So I think hitting on that is really interesting. When I think about trust, I recently heard trust portrayed as your character, but also your capabilities. So
Right.
what I think with that, as it relates to the coffee project, there was a lot of trust. We trusted the exploration team and their capabilities. We trusted project management and their capabilities, but we still questioned, I think, collectively to understand. And as a result of that, I think it was a really symbiotic relationship and really a good team. So when I reflect on that, I've got a lot of positive memories or positive takeaways from that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think part of the trust, it ties in with the ability to ask questions, because people, so long as you've spent the time developing the rapport and the connection with the individuals who you're working with, when you ask difficult questions, they understand that the questions aren't questioning their expertise or their knowledge, but they are exploratory questions seeking to understand. And that framing that can be very difficult without a history of trust and relationship development. So that background work before you get into the really tough phases of projects is so important.
Totally agree with that. I think, you said framing it. What I have found is that when you're about to embark on a series of questions, what I have found to be helpful, and I'd be really interested in your thoughts, is just to do exactly what you say. Frame it. Say to the group, to the individual, my intent is something you hit on before, but my intent is to understand or to seek clarification so that I can comprehend what's going on, so that if there's something that I can bring to the table of value, then I can do that. But until I understand and have that context, it's really tough. So that's the nature of my questioning. Maybe I would ask you, James, how do you look at that? How do you go about framing the circumstance so that the other individuals feel comfortable?
But it can be really difficult, especially if you're in a position of power, and being aware that you are maybe the most senior person in the room. That can affect the way people respond, because when you say something from a position of power, it's not necessarily understood as a suggestion or an idea, but is often understood as an instruction. And ensuring that that is understood early on, and that your team will perceive you in that context, I think is really important. And so there's a couple of things. One is, setting up that rapport and that relationship with the individual so that they can understand that. But you can never really disentangle that, because that will always exist, you as the decision maker or the most senior person. So being aware that your voice and suggestions can sometimes be seen as decisions is important. And so obviously that means we have to be a little bit more careful and aware of what we're saying, because it can affect outcomes without even our realization. And then the other piece is a little bit of a preamble. And I think one of the things that you and I both do is we don't pretend to know everything, because we sure don't.
Definitely not.
My gaps in knowledge are vast. And freely admitting that and owning that can actually be beneficial in facilitating those more open discussions, where I'm not an expert in geomechanical engineering, for example. Definitely not. So when I'm asking these questions of these teams, how encouraging them to walk me through the process that they use to reach certain decisions can actually help the rest of the group understand, and maybe also identify opportunities or other things, because it's almost like a request for my request of them for a knowledge dump can help the overall project.
Yeah, I think that's true. And what I have found as well is that if you ask someone or a team to step you through it, what is the thought process? How are you going about doing this? What is the desired result at the end of the day?
Yeah.
And questioning, again, analytically, but curiously, why are you doing it that way? Why not look at it this way? And then if it's followed up with help me understand, not that I'm being critical, but I just want to understand. What I have found, and I assume that this is similar for you, is that oftentimes people are like, well, shit, I didn't even think about that. Like, I was just going through the process to go through the process. But you're right, there are opportunities in certain areas, or maybe we don't need to do that, or maybe we should do more of it. But whatever the case, I know for me personally, when I step through something with my team and we unpack it and we break it apart, there's always something we find that we can do better. And I think being open-minded to that can be really beneficial for everyone.
Yeah, and trying to make sure that people don't become defensive through your lines of questioning. And if you go in that direction, being aware that that's happening. So you've got to be using your emotional intelligence, which I think as project managers is really important. And has been made more difficult with Zoom because you can't see full body language. When somebody tenses up and you've got a pile of 10 or more people, it's really hard to capture that. But when you're in person, you can capture those kind of things a lot more easily. And whenever those things happen, watching for those kind of interactions, being aware, and then being prepared to intervene and say, I noticed you were concerned, or was there something that we talked about that that isn't hitting the right notes, or these kind of conversations, especially if somebody hasn't been participating and they're quiet, is usually a great indication that you need to touch base with them and create that space for dissent.
Absolutely. No, I think you're bringing up a really good point. If you're in a conversation with 5, 10, 15 individuals and one person hasn't said one word the whole time, I would imagine in most instances there's a lot going on in that person's mind that they want to get off their chest but haven't quite figured out how. And I think as leaders, we can help tease that out by one, caring, first of all, but then two, being curious and seeking to involve others. But you're right, in practice, it's tough. It's tough. I think, yes, being remote introduces different variables to the equation, no question. Nonetheless, I think it's just being aware and observing people's behavior and tone, inflection, body language, all of those things, eye movement, that can be really, really helpful. I don't get the sense though, James, I'd be curious on your take on this. I don't think there's a lot of conversation on a macro level within our industry about behavior and emotion and decision making process and why humans do what they do. I don't know if that is consistent for you or if that's different, or maybe tell us about some experience around that. I'd be curious.
So this is a really interesting space and something that I am definitely interested in. I've noticed. So I did take a bit of a hiatus from industry, a sabbatical, after I left Goldcorp, and I explored a completely different industry. I spent 18 months really doing a deep dive into the tech space. You and I actually participated together in a few spin out business ideas and stuff that was really interesting, web platform, iOS stuff, which was really eye-opening, seeing how a completely different industry works. So I went to a couple industry conferences and a few speaker series there. And just to compare and contrast, they get between our industry and theirs, is the industry events are always well attended with a variety of people from the tech space or from a mining space. That's the same. But the difference comes in the talks that are being held at the mining conference are, how are we going to be more effective in screening using this new vibratory screening plate? Or here's the history of the geological formation of XYZ deposit. Or, getting into some of the more social aspects there, we do now have breakout sessions on social and permitting and licensing. But when you go to the tech conferences, some of them have a little bit of that, like, oh, we've created this new wireless mesh system that uses people's phone, or there's a blockchain thing. But there's a huge section of those conferences that focuses on how do we retain people, what are you doing to address remote work, how can leaders be more emotionally seen to be more emotionally vulnerable in front of their people, how can leaders deal with mental health challenges. These are real conversations that I've been to, and I've seen these conversations. There was one event in Vancouver I went to. It was organized by a couple of women. They've called their event series TNT events. If you're in Vancouver and you ever see posting for those, they're always great. It was a 3-person panel of founders of tech companies, and they were specifically talking about the mental exhaustion and the fatigue that is faced by founders, and how to develop mental resiliency for periods of intense challenge. We do not have those conversations in mining and exploration. And I think that part of it is this, old boys club that mining still represents. Not saying tech is not a boys club. It certainly has a lot of challenges there. But there's a sort of sense of being tough is still valued, and showing any of those sorts of emotional or mental vulnerabilities are seen as weakness instead. And so they are not discussed. And I think that's something that we as an industry could do a little bit better, because there's a lot of opportunity to learn. I think things like, conference series or speaker series that focus more on retaining people, growing your people. I mean, the basic blocking and tackling of business, we don't ever, or seldom ever at small scale, have HR departments. There's seldom ever annual reviews or anything like that. And I think CEOs and executive leadership teams could really benefit from more of those types of conversations. The sort of Harvard Business Review reading group and the mining group, I think, have a very small overlap in between those two executive groups.
No, I think I absolutely agree with you. My observation, or a couple of thoughts there, on one of the recent Mavericks roundtable discussions, one of the panelists, highlighted the fact that psychology and emotional intelligence and the way people behave and things like that, mindset, is just not even really being discussed. I think they're, at least not in the mainstream. So to call out another industry and say that you're seeing those types of conversations take place is really interesting. For myself personally, one of the things that I do in addition to the work in the mining space is around coaching consultants, and something that I really, really enjoy. As a result of that, I also see the juxtaposition of mining versus consulting. And there's a ton of time, a ton of effort, energy, research, conversation about how your mental health matters, and how being in shape, or what you put into your body, all of those things actually make a difference. And as I was recently interviewed by Carly at the Intelligent Miner, that was one of the things that I talked about, and one of the things that I'm passionate about, because I think it matters. Actually, I don't think it matters. I know it matters. And I want to bring that conversation to mining and metals, and in particular projects, because I think there's an opportunity to make a huge impact on what is a very troubled industry, in my opinion. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I totally agree, and I think that our generation is making some progress. I know that the dialogue around mental health has changed in the last sort of decade, but really accelerated due to COVID. I mean, we're now openly talking about mental health as being health, not just a specific sub thing that, mental health, but it's actually being discussed on par with the pandemic, and they're talking about the silent mental health pandemic that's accompanying the pandemic. So this is something that's really important, and I think that it also ties into a little bit of what we see from some of the historical management styles in our industry, which I would describe as very command and control, very domineering, very sort of ultra masculine, pointy, aggressive management styles. And that management style is thankfully on the way out. I think you still see it a little bit more in projects than you do in other aspects of the industry. Operations, you can't really effectively operate with that type of style anymore. And I think that the younger generations are much less tolerant of that approach now. So I was actually very fortunate early on to have a mentor who kind of taught me a little bit more about what I would call soft management, that management didn't have to be pointy or domineering, but that could be more confidence building, managing through expectations and supporting and still holding accountable, but not, coming and pushing everybody else out of the way and just having the floor to yourself all the time. And I think there's more of that coming. I think our industry could do more, and I think we all have more to learn about that. And those kind of conversations we need to start having, and maybe we need to start thinking about sessions at some of our major conferences or other places, creating new forums for the exchange of ideas and sharing of experiences in areas like management strategies for retention, management strategies for the optimization of people performance. I mean, one of the things I was just talking to my CEO about was there's a book that was published a while ago called The No Asshole Rule. And it all looks into the organizational cost of hiring assholes. And he was saying to me that there's a new HBR article that focuses on the role of star performers, but star performers who are jerks, basically, and how they might be doing individually amazing performance, but the performance of the overall team is brought down, and so the total performance of the company is less as a result of these so-called star performers who are actually dragging down overall organizational effectiveness. I haven't read the article yet, but I've got to go pull it up on and have a read. But I think we need to, as an industry, start having some more of those conversations, because people are having those conversations in sidebars. But I think there's an opportunity to become better leaders in the industry and become a better industry by facilitating some of those discussions.
I completely agree with you. And my team and I will try to find that article and link it up in the show notes. You brought back something I wanted to circle back on, which was mentoring and coaching and developing. And then if I take that, the importance of that, people have often heard me say is that anytime I've made a transformation in my life, it was the result of a mentor, a coach, somebody that, where there was a give-take relationship, somebody that was willing to invest in me and helping me get better. But on the flip side of that, you think about the benefit for the mentor in the sense that if you instill trust in your employees and you give them the freedom to make decisions, of course you're going to help guide them. But what I have seen that do for a team substantially benefits the company and the mentor, not just the mentee.
Mm-hmm.
And showing trust in someone really helps drive and get the best and highest use out of that individual. Where on the inverse of that, beating somebody into submission, I've never seen that work where you get the best and highest out of somebody, nor any loyalty or reason to show up and work extra hard. So I think those are really, really, really important points that you're raising.
Yeah, I think one thing that you mentioned, beating it to submission, is there's an adage I'm sure everybody's heard, is people don't leave companies, they leave managers. And if somebody is being brought underfoot and treated that way, they're on their way out. They might not even realize it yet, but they're not going to stay around. It's a finite time span you're talking about. And so if that happens, one of the things we don't look at in our industry is what's called presenteeism, which is people who are there but are not engaged.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And I think that happens a lot on projects where people are, treated as disposable or seasonal or temporary. And you might say it doesn't matter because the project's only 18 months, or in some cases 6 months. But you can have somebody working at 40% effectiveness for 6 months. It's a big difference if they were working at peak effectiveness. So I think treating people, especially temporary staff, on contract staff, with the same level of respect and discourse that you would permanent full-time staff, or some of these, they're all equally important, and just because their time frame is shorter doesn't mean their concerns should be addressed. I mean, I think about things like, oh, it's fine, we'll just get a temporary camp that's old and dilapidated, we'll just put 2 people in a room, it doesn't matter, they're only there for 16 months. Well, yeah, but that's their life. They're going to go from this project to another 16-month project. So why make it really nice for the operations people just because? Anyway, it's a bit of a it's not my problem thing that happens, and I know one of your passions is the tension and not tension. I don't know how to exactly describe it, that occurs between owners and contractors.
Sure.
It's something that maybe not get into here, but I'm sure you have a ton of other content on exactly that topic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right. I'm very passionate about that. The relationship between owners and contractors, and how I believe you can create a relationship between the two that is stronger than if not. So certainly something I'm really passionate about. But you're right. You hit on something I wanna say again, because I think it's important for our listeners to hear. The 16 months at a time. I'm on a project, I'm in the field for 16 months, but then if that's the type of role I'm in another camp for 24 and then 36. Yep. So for the next, you have folks that have been living 16 months to 36 months or 48 for 30 years.
Yeah.
And what that's like, that's just so taxing. And I think something that is often underplayed or certainly not talked about. So appreciate you pulling that forward. When we talk about mental health and mentorship and coaching, a lot of those things I believe to be front and center at the question that I'm going to ask you, which is, how do we make mining sexy again? And I think for newer generations and current generations too, there's a lot of value placed on that human element of people development, people retention, and stuff like that. How do you see making mining sexy in the future?
It's a tough question. And I think one of the things I saw when I dabbled in the tech space for 18 months is that the young people coming up, they want to work for industries and businesses that have a cause, or are trying to make a difference, or trying to make the world a better place in some way. And I think for a long time, the mining industry has sort of rested on this concept of, well, everybody needs what we have.
Sure.
We have metals. The world can't function without them. So this is an essential service. But that might be true, we're having trouble attracting people. We know that we're having trouble attracting people. It is a massive, massive problem. I'm already seeing salaries going up for entry-level staff like crazy, like 40% in a year kind of thing right now, because the industry's going through another big boom. And part of the things that has destroyed people coming up in the industry is these boom and bust cycles, and you get these big waves and these cohorts that go through. There's a bit of a cohort around our age, and then there's kind of not really very many people, and there's a few people coming out who are sort of in their 20s and early 30s, but there's not a lot of them. And I think, yeah, part of it is that our reputation as an industry is not great, and that is well earned based on some historical performance of operations and projects throughout the world. We've made a lot of progress. Our safety performance as an industry is getting much better. In fact, I think we're actually outperforming on average. Our industry safety statistics are better than most other industries. But that's not being advertised. We are making progress also on, there's a few projects that have really truly been successfully closed, which was never the case. You still look up mine closure and you're going to turn up a bunch of super sites, not the ones that have been closed successfully. We have a long way to go before we not just get to the point where we're making a difference and a positive impact in the world, but to the point where we're a neutral industry that is providing a good, but is minimizing degradation.
Hmm.
And we're getting there as an industry. We've made progress, but we're still only meeting regulatory thresholds. We're not sort of stepping up to the next level to be, things like carbon neutral. There are projects that are heading that direction. I know Newmont's Borden project is really interesting with electrification of their underground. More projects are going to start doing those things. Those things are really important for our industry to be putting out front and talking about, because they're showing that we are making progress. I think one of the things that is a challenge is that we as an industry offer undifferentiated product, which you and I have talked a little bit about that before, but for people who aren't familiar with it, is if you were to buy gold from Newmont, or you buy gold from Kinross, or you buy gold from a artisanal producer somewhere in Africa,
Right.
it's the same gold. There's no way to tell the difference. So companies are incentivized to be able to produce the gold for as cheap as possible, because that's their margin, because they can't sell it for any more than the other company can sell it for.
Right.
So is there an opportunity in the future, and I know there's been a little bit of discussion about this in the industry, to use things like blockchain technology to actually track the provenance of raw materials in order to create a desire for higher, not higher quality, but higher sustainability index or something like that,
Sure.
materials for companies that are consumer facing, that are going to start asking for these things. I know Tesla's interested in securing supply chain. They want to try to create, what's the word I'm looking for? More sustainable supply chain.
Sure.
And I don't know how we can get to that without something that creates or enables a differentiated product between producers.
Yeah, no, good point. I know that De Beers has leaned into that with their diamonds, and I know BHP has as well. So for those
Yeah.
that are interested, there's a couple of good case studies out there on both of those companies and what they're doing. But I think you're absolutely right. I also think that, in a sense, for whatever reason, as an industry, I think we're a bit modest. I think that there are, I think there's a subculture of individuals and companies who want to do things better. I know it. I talk to them all the time.
Definitely.
And I also think that there are a lot of really positive initiatives out there that just don't get the airplay that a tailings failure does. And I'm not saying that it should, or that tailings failures are acceptable, or endorsing that by any stretch of the imagination, because they're horrible. The point is, though, that there are good initiatives out there that I don't think really get mainstream attention, when in my humble opinion could probably use a bit more airplay. So, well, James, one of the things that I want to ask you, or I guess maybe the last two-part question that I want to ask you is where do you want the industry to be in 10 years? And then where do you think it will be in 10 years?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, part of this is getting into the making mining sexy question that you had, which is, I'd like to rephrase as, how do you make mining attractive more broadly, not just to people potentially entering the industry, but also our partners who we rely on to develop, like in indigenous populations and local communities. It's critical that the industry puts their best foot forward in order to make that possible. And I think there's a few things we can do in addition to what we've already talked about with a differentiated product. Is there's a big movement towards ESG reporting. BlackRock is pushing that. I think at some point that's going to get mandated, but we can get ahead of that as an industry. I know the big players are already doing some of that, but the juniors need to catch up. And I think some of them are already starting to work on that, which is fantastic. So ESG reporting, I think, is going to become the norm. The other thing that I think we need to do a lot better job of is diversity, equity, and inclusivity as our industry, because people can't see themselves in the industry unless they're seeing others who represent them in our industry. So I think optimistically 10 years, we could actually look at things like gender balance on board of directors. I don't think there's anything really holding us back at this point, except for not pursuing that with enough intent. And I think there's more we can do to make our industry more friendly and supportive of the BIPOC community and the LGBTQ community as well, which we also aren't doing. And those kind of initiatives and supporting these groups, it is really important to the future viability of our industry, because we're missing out on a lot of really good talent. We're also missing out on a lot of diversity of viewpoints and ideas, which we're not getting. And I realized the irony of two bald white guys talking about this. But I think that our industry can do more in that area. And I think it's on us now, as our generation is becoming the leaders in the industry, to support and push those types of initiatives. So that's kind of the one that, my hope for the industry moving that way.
Yeah, no, sure.
One thing that I think is going to happen that we have to also address and be very open about is automation is coming. One of the mines companies I'm working with is looking at a mine that's about 10 years in the future to start to build. We're not going to have people running the drills on site. We're not going to have people running the shovels. We're not going to have people running the trucks. We're going to be automating core logging. These things are all coming. So yes, we have skill shortage, but this is going to be counterbalanced like that. And so one of the things that I want to leave maybe to think about is, how do we reframe the value proposition we make to the communities and the First Nations, indigenous people whose lands we work in, when the jobs piece is going to be much less significant than it was before. So much of the value proposition we make to these people is that there's going to be jobs.
Right.
But the reality is that the industry and the world is moving much more automated. How do we reframe our value propositions to still say that this creates value for these communities? And what does that value look like if the exchange is not related somehow to employment of the local community? There will still be some, and we need to start earlier because engaging with them, because the level of education and skills required to support the technology is going to be higher. But it's not going to be the simple value proposition that we used to have, which was jobs and contracting, because that is changing.
No, I think you're right, and I think interesting to learn more about that. Hopefully, we can dive into that in some detail in another session. But I want to give a plug to Andy Reynolds and Inspire Resources. Their mantra is, mining as a service, as opposed to the opposite. So if anyone's interested in that, I would say check out Andy and Inspire, because it's right in line with what you're talking about, James. So appreciate that. Well, before we sign off, James, I think I really appreciate you taking the time to come and chat with us today. I think there are 1,000 different conversations that we could have based on the different topics that we covered that we just weren't able to get into as deep as I know you understand. So for those who want to get into that untapped intellect, how can people find you? How can people connect with you?
Yeah, the best way to reach out to me is on LinkedIn. You'll be able to find me by searching James Scott Kamenak or James Scott Goldcorp. Those are, or Fireweed Zinc. Those are all on there, and I think it's James.Scott, but I might be wrong on that. I haven't checked my own LinkedIn in a couple days.
Yeah, fair enough. We can link that in on the show notes as well, so people will be able to find you. Perfect. All right, James. Once again, thank you very much for supporting the Mavericks and for being on today.
Thanks, Jason. That was really fun.
All right, James. Take care.